This is the Metal Gateway Podcast.
Hey everybody, welcome to the show. As I said on one of the earlier episodes, when I started this project, I didn't know exactly where it was going to go, and I didn't even really know if anyone was going to agree to give me an hour of their time. So my plan was just start with interviewing people I knew who either had done interesting things in metal or who had interesting stories to tell, or both. So on the first episode, I interviewed Joe Gersh, my old friend from high school, who helped to inspire this entire project of the entire project of this podcast. On the last episode, I interviewed my old friend Matt Jacobson, who's the founder of Relapse Records. And this week, I'm really excited to give you another interview with a friend of mine. His name is Jeff Braimes. Jeff has done a number of things in music, but for the purposes of this podcast, I think one of the most interesting things he's done is that he was the vocalist for a band called Panic. Panic was formed in the mid-1980s, and by 1991, they had signed a deal with Metal Blade for 2 albums, and the first of those, which was called Epidemic, came out in 1991 and was produced by the H-Team, which was made up of Gary Holt and Rick Hunolt of Exodus. Jeff's experience in Panic and their presence as part of Seattle's burgeoning heavy music scene around that time, late 80s, early 90s, I thought gives Jeff a particular perspective on what was going on in and around that time in Seattle, which, in 90 and 91, as we all know at this point, was sort of ground zero for heavy music in the United States with the emergence of grunge. So I just wanted Jeff to be able to tell you that story, and I hope you enjoy it. So thanks for listening.
Like so many white American men in their 50s and 60s.
And you're how old?
I'll be 59.
Okay.
Like so many of us, my gateway to rock music, not only metal, but rock music in general, popular music really, was through Kiss.
Mm.
And it was the mid-70s, and I was just the prototypical Kiss, young, suburban Kiss geek.
Mm-hmm.
And it opened, all doors were opened for me by Gene, Paul, Ace, and Peter.
And so how old were you when you discovered this band, and how did you come across them? Like, how did they come into your life?
Yeah, well, I'm sort of embarrassed to actually say how it happened, because I didn't have an older sibling.
Yeah.
I didn't have a sort of ne'er-do-well uncle. I didn't really have any older kids in the neighborhood that I could look to. So I had to find it out on the street, And there was no rock and roll in my household. My mother was in her mid-20s, in the mid-60s, and she could have been into rock music, but that just wasn't part of our household.
Yeah. What was she listening to? What were your folks listening to?
There wasn't a lot. At that point, I had a stepfather, and he was really into big band jazz.
Uh-huh.
And I was into jazz, too. I played the trumpet at school, and so we had that in common. So there was some big band jazz in the house. But before those two got married in 1976, it was Trenny Lopez and Pete Fountain and television theme shows, maybe the neighbor's radio. There was no popular music being that I was exposed to growing up.
Right.
And so in the mid-70s, when we moved to Washington State from the Bay Area, I'm embarrassed to say that I first came to know about Kiss through the teen magazines that my younger sister was bringing home. And it had nothing to do with music. It had everything to do with image. And I know that's a common knock on Kiss, is that they were all form and no function, or they were all image and no substance. And I would say to those people, still to this day, that those people probably haven't really listened deeply to, the early Kiss music before they got so comic booky.
Mm-hmm.
Because the first 3 Kiss records in particular, and the second 3 Kiss records to a degree, were some great sort of gut level, waist level rock and roll.
Yeah.
For sure. But they got the reputation, deservedly so, for being sort of a pandering, cereal box band. But that is how I came to know about them. And it didn't matter in the end. I got to the same place that I would have been had I had a more pure approach to discovery.
Right.
But that's how it happened.
So you were drawn in by the imagery, but then, what kind of carried you from there?
The music.
Right. What about it?
It was when I first put on my first record, and most people say, oh, I was in middle school when I discovered them, or I remember, I can pinpoint the hour of the day that I first put on that first record, and it was Kiss Love Gun on Christmas Day, 1977. And for our custom in our household, and I think it's pretty common, is that Santa brings you an unwrapped, your main present under the tree, and then your family gives you wrapped presents. But the main thing from Santa is the big thing. And for me that year, it was a stereo. It wasn't really a stereo. It was just a powered turntable. Santa may have purchased it at Jafco, but it was a Lloyd's brand turntable with 2 speakers, no 8-track, no cassette, and really importantly, no tuner.
Right.
So I just had the turntable, and there was 1 record wrapped under the tree. And I knew that it was either Maynard Ferguson's Conquistador record, which was the current Maynard Ferguson record at the time,
mm-hmm.
or it was Kiss Love Gun, which I had asked for. And as I held the red striped wrapping paper record in my lap on Christmas morning, amid the considerable wreckage of another Christmas morning, sugar cookie crumbs and wadded up wrapping paper, I knew it was I sensed that my entire life was headed in one of 2 directions. What is it? Is it whose cat? Is it Droplinker's cat? The dead cat, live cat?
Oh, Schrodinger's cat.
Schrodinger's cat.
Yeah.
So, it was a total Schrodinger's cat.
The cat's in the box. Is the cat alive or is the cat dead?
It was. Is it Maynard Ferguson's Conquistador or is it Kiss Love Gun?
Yeah. So this was Schrodinger's record, basically.
Exactly.
For you.
2 completely pre-lived lives stretching out before me in opposite directions.
Sure.
And it was going to go one way or the other. And of course, it was Kiss Love Gun. I thanked the rock and roll gods, dismissed myself to my room, plugged in my new turntable, put on the first side of Kiss Love Gun. And the first song is I Stole Your Love. And when I heard those chords, I had never heard the music. I had no reference. I wasn't finally getting to hear the record all the time. I was just getting to hear the record for the first time. I had no idea what they sounded like.
Right.
It's such a backward way to get into the whole thing.
Yeah.
Like I say, it worked, but it was a little unorthodox.
No, I get it. And so you went, you had Love Gun and you listened to this as a teenager.
Yeah. Like at 1:00 p.m. on Christmas Day, 1977, I was a completely different person than I had been at noon.
Right. Yeah.
And then what I did for the next several months is just listen to Kiss Love Gun. I had didn't have anything else. I didn't have a tuner. There was no rock and roll radio. There was no AOR radio to listen to. I just went back and forth between side 2 and side 1 of Kiss Love Gun all day, every day until I went to sleep.
Wow.
Until I got Kiss Alive 2. Probably in the spring.
Yeah.
And after that, I started to collect the solo albums that were coming out in 1978 as well.
Right.
And I had collected most of the Kiss catalog before I ever got Cheap Trick live at Budokan.
Right.
So, I was exclusive. Kiss was my first bitch, probably more accurate to say that I was their bitch.
Yeah.
Because I was paying them and I continued to pay them for decades.
All right. So where did it go from there? just tell me the story of like connect it, through this, like the end of the 70s.
Yeah.
And like, what was the path that, you said there was that fully lived life that stretched out before you, right?
Right.
So what was the path? Where did it go from there?
Well, in the summer of 1978, I did have a friend in the neighborhood, an older friend. He was just a year older, but he had an older sister. And I very distinctly remember she had the first Van Halen record, which came out that came out in February of 1978. So it's literally, it's 6 weeks after I fell in love with Love Gun.
Mm-hmm.
The first Van Halen record's out there. And I remember going over to Colin's house and Tracy put that record on. And it was unlike anything, obviously unlike anything I'd ever heard. I just had 5 Kiss records by that time. And Kiss's sound was like everybody else's sound, but Van Halen's sound, that first Van Halen record is such a departure from sonically, from anything that had come before. It's just such a violent, bright, it's like a huge shark, that record.
Yeah.
And it scared the fuck out of me. It was so much more vivid than the tiny compressed sound on my Kiss records. Kiss was a very safe, there were some good tones on those Kiss records, but they were pretty compressed compared to the first Van Halen.
Yeah.
And that record scared me so bad, not just the sound, but the looking at the cover, looking at that picture of Michael Anthony on the back of the first Van Halen record scared me to death. And so I went and got Cheap Trick Live at Budokan instead.
Yeah.
And it wasn't for years before I would double back to Van Halen. But so to answer your question, through Kiss, I got into Cheap Trick. And from there, it was probably Styx, Rush, that path.
Right.
And then eventually, the next big milepost for me was AC/DC.
Right.
And that was a very important discovery. And I could chart it out. I could flow chart it out and see where here's Kiss is this huge blip, and then DC,
Yeah.
Highway to Hell was just such a profound discovery.
Yeah. And when along this path did you start like going and seeing these bands live? Because I always want to know when I'm talking to people about this, like, obviously album discoveries are always really key. They were for me.
Yep.
But some of those early concert memories were also incredibly important and definitely changed things for, I think, all of us.
Totally.
So tell me about some of those.
So the companion piece to my immersion in Kiss, and for so many guys I know, Love Gun was their first record, and that Kiss show on November 21st, 1979 in the Seattle Coliseum was their first show. Like, it's such a fraternity. I know, and I didn't know them then, but my bros growing up and into adulthood, if that was your first show, you're in that club. So yeah, November 21st, 1979, the Rockets opened. It was my first rock concert. And my friend Greg
this was at the Coliseum.
At the Coliseum.
Yeah.
And we slept out all night to get tickets at the Burien Lamont's store at the store. We slept out to buy tickets for a festival seating show that wasn't ever even going to sell out. So that's how geeky we were. So we got the tickets. We went early in the day. Greg's mom dropped us off in the station wagon like she had dropped us off at so many other unrelated functions in the past. And we got in line and we were probably 100 people back. By the time the doors opened, way later in the day, we were probably 500 people back. But we still got a pretty good spot on the floor. We didn't know what to do. We'd never been to a rock concert before. We had no idea how to behave or what you're supposed to do when you got inside. So we went to the stage and we were probably 10 people back. And then we just didn't know if we should stay there or try to get a seat. So by the time we bailed out of the pit, the good seats were kind of taken. And we ended up just kind of walking around, looking at merch and enjoying the show from kind of the back of the floor.
Yeah.
And I will say that that first rock concert experience was kind of a disappointment. I mean, at the time, I had all these Kiss records, And I had some magazines and I had some pictures of them, what they played like live. But there was, of course, no MTV.
Right.
You couldn't just go on YouTube and watch any number of Kiss documentaries or cell phone held pictures from concerts. Actual footage of them playing live it just didn't exist. So I knew what it was supposed to look like. I didn't know what it was supposed to sound like or smell like, because the Coliseum in 79 had that particular smell that I later would, of course, realize was zigzag papers burning. But the sound was shitty.
Yeah.
And my back hurt. I'd been standing up all day, and it was a letdown, kind of a letdown.
Yeah.
I quickly learned to acclimate my expectations to all of those shitty truths about going to big stadium rock concerts. But it was definitely Kiss the first time, and that was in the 1970s. So I saw Kiss. I'm proud to say that I saw the original members of Kiss in makeup in the 1970s. It was only 5 weeks before the end of the decade.
Right.
But I saw that rock concert in the 70s.
Yeah. So we got to the end of the 70s now. Let's talk about the 80s, because I feel like the 80s was a super important decade.
Yeah.
Certainly for rock, just generally, but especially for metal and the birth of what we now know as like extreme metal.
Yep.
All that stuff really came to a head in the 80s.
Yep.
So tell me about your path through that decade.
Well, so if we go back, so I'm at AC/DC in 1980. Highway to Hell comes out in 1980. And I'm completely inside that record. And I've got at this point, I've got a kind of base. I've got my Cheap Trick records. I've got my Rush records. I've got my Kiss records. I'm a little more balanced at this point. And I'm super into DC. And I had seen Cheap Trick live, and I had seen, I guess I didn't see Rush until Moving Pictures, but I'd seen some stadium shows. And then the next big blip for me in 81, summer of 81, is High and Dry. Mm-hmm. And it's such an important record for me because like Kiss, Cheap Trick, Rush, even AC/DC. Is it metal? I mean, you got to go back and kind of, you got to define what it means. I don't think those are, if you break down the criteria of heavy metal, I don't think that those bands are heavy metal bands. Mm. Def Leppard's kind of a heavy metal band. It's light metal, but I mean, High and Dry is such a masterpiece. And at the time, it was, I mean, I couldn't imagine that any record was better than Highway to Hell.
Yeah.
And it shares so much. I mean, obviously the Mutt Lange's stamp is heavily embedded into it, but it's such a, it has a dimension beyond what Highway to Hell has. And Highway to Hell is one of my favorite records of all time. Mm. But High and Dry was and they were kids and they were hungry and it was so sexy. And that was just a really, really big record.
Now, you hadn't been into them until that, because they had an album before that.
Yeah, On Through the Night had been released. I got into that retroactively, and don't really care for that record very much. And then, the thing with Def Leppard is that the minute I heard the first song on Pyromania, I was just destroyed. I don't think there's a record that I dislike more than that of any record that's ever come out, because they were my favorite band.
Right.
And that record is such a disappointment. Obviously, big commercial record.
Yeah.
But it just doesn't have any of the snap. It doesn't have any of the danger. It doesn't have any of the. It just doesn't have the. It's not a good record. It's not a rock and roll record. And then of course they got so much worse from there. But I saw them that tour, so 81, and this
on
was
Pyromania tour.
No. On the
High and Dry
tour.
Okay.
So it was our first time in the States. They were opening for Blackfoot.
Yeah.
And they just came out and just like, it was at the Moore Theater. It was on Halloween, 1981. And it was such a departure for me because my concert experiences to that point had always been in arenas. So there's a British rock star on a 10-foot stage who comes in the back door and leaves in the back door. But this was a theater.
Yeah.
Moore Theater holds 1,200 people, and it was downtown. It wasn't at Seattle Center. And I drove myself, and I was dressed as Angus Young. It was Halloween. I had a great seat. I stood on it, and they were just so electric. They were just so powerful.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a big night for me on so many levels.
Yeah, yeah.
And then after Leopard, it's like then the doors are completely off the whole thing, because it's new wave of British heavy metal.
Right.
Right. And so that starts a completely new era. And that's really when it transitions from hard rock to real heavy metal.
Yeah, and I feel like Def Leppard was right on the. They were a bridge between those two to me, in my mind. And it's funny to hear you say this about Pyromania, because at some point in the life of this podcast, like, I'm going to have somebody, maybe you, interview me to tell my story, right? Because I feel like eventually people are going to want to hear my story, but I don't want this podcast to be about me, but maybe that'll be an episode at some point. But Pyromania actually figures into my story.
Okay.
But it's just funny to hear you say that, because you and I have talked about all kinds of things over the years, and we've never talked about that album.
Had this conversation.
We've never talked about that album.
Yeah.
So anyway, I just
well, you're a little younger than me, and so your perspective on Pyromania could be completely different.
It was totally different, and I didn't discover High and Dry until years later.
Oh, yeah.
And so anyway, but I don't want to go down that rabbit hole right now. So yeah, we're at a crossroads now: hard rock or new wave of British heavy metal.
Right.
I think I know where you went mostly.
Oh, I still always enjoyed. Like, who is like AC/DC transitions at that point, because Bond dies. I would still not rebuke my hard rock stuff,
mm-hmm.
but I mean, it was so exciting at that time to be anticipating those early, new wave of British heavy metal records. Saxon was probably my favorite.
Yeah.
I mean, I was more into Saxon and Motorhead. Not that Motorhead's a new wave of British heavy metal band, and not that Motorhead's a heavy metal band. I think that goes back to that same discussion. Are they heavy metal? Absolutely not, but embraced by the same crowds, for sure.
For sure. And I mean, it's a debatable point, though, I think. I mean, I get where you're coming from, but I think a lot of people would disagree with you on that.
Yeah.
I don't know where I stand on that one, but I think some people would disagree with you.
Yeah, I guess you have to kind of map out your criteria and decide what. I mean, I just think Motorhead is a completely irresponsible, ear-splittingly loud, bad idea rock band.
Everything louder than everything else.
Just everything louder than everything else.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I was more kind of into the street level, like Saxon, like they were singing about motorcycles and Chevys and Motorhead, rather than Maiden and Priest.
Right.
Not that Priest is a new wave of British heavy metal band either, but more into the street level stuff than the fantasy or the more classical music based heavy metal. I mean, Iron Maiden. Although the first two Maiden records are certainly more street level than after Di'Anno left and Bruce came in.
For sure.
But not that I didn't devour every Maiden record. And I saw them on the Number of the Beast tour.
Mm-hmm.
Proud to say that was a great show, and that's a historically significant show too. It's Scorpion's show. They're headlining. Maiden's opening, and Girl School is the first band on the bill.
I was going to bring them up because they were certainly figuring in that whole thing at the time too, because they were kind of street.
They were totally street. Yeah. I mean, they could barely play.
Right.
And not to disparage them for being girls, but they were always kind of viewed as a bit of a novelty because they were girls. I mean, Lemmy was at that show, that Maiden Scorpions Girl School show. It was at Heck Ed.
Yeah.
82, summer of 82, I think.
Wow, on the UW campus.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. And Lemmy was there?
I was told Lemmy was there because he was hanging out with Girl School. I mean, those guys were buddies.
Well, and they were kind of proteges of
Absolutely.
His. Yeah.
Yeah.
So here we are. We're kind of now, I'm feeling like we're kind of in the mid 80s.
Yep. Well, let's not go past 82 too quick because what year does Kill 'Em All come out? 82?
Kill 'Em All was 83, if I remember correctly.
All right. because that's the next blip.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're talking about, seems like every 5 years there's something that comes out that just like completely just makes everything that's come before it practically irrelevant.
Yep.
And Metallica certainly did that. I mean, that first record was just like, it's not my favorite, probably not my favorite Metallica record, and Metallica's not my favorite band of that genre, but it was so, the anticipation. And that's another thing too that's worth discussing, is that like without MTV or without the internet or whatever you call it, like how did you even know what was coming? You had a guy at the record store. Budget Tapes and Records in Federal Way was very active. There was a guy in there whose uncle ran the store, and he knew everything, and his uncle was buying what he said to buy. Of course, Easy Street Records in Bellevue was a big outlet. But, you know, you're waiting for Kerrang to come out. Mm-hmm. And then there was the fanzines and real tape trading. I mean, real honest to goodness, heavy metal underground. Mm-hmm. And it was so intoxicating to be part of it. And I remember first kind of merging into that underground and just discovering how much connectivity there was and how much, I mean, we talk about community. I mean, it was such a community. Mm-hmm. And so the anticipation for Metallica was incredible.
Yeah. I mean, those magazines like Kerrang! And I remember seeing back like Hit Parader was out there too, and it was kind of, you know, more of a, I don't know, it didn't seem as serious as Kerrang! Right, to me. It
wasn't curated to the extent. I mean, right. Kerrang! Was just like, this is brand new.
Yeah.
I mean, Hit Parader was like, okay, I already know Scorpions and I already know Kiss and I already know these bands.
Yeah. It was more about like celebrating the bands that we like rather than discovery, right?
Oh yeah, it was news.
Yeah, and so discovering music at that time was such a different thing, because you would hear about it from, you know, a friend or a friend of a friend, or, you know, oh, somebody was talking about this band, and, you know, here's a tape, check this out, and, you know, you'd, you know, put it in your Walkman on the way to school, and oh wow, I've never heard this before, you know, like, and so much stuff got discovered like that, you know. So Kill 'Em All is 83, and then, you know, there's other things that are happening around that time too. But I'm interested in, you know, what was it for you? Like, where'd you go from Kill 'Em All?
Well, to back up like 6 months. So probably, I think one of the most important things that ever happened to me was, and again, I'll tell you exactly the date. It was August 29th, 1982. And a great resource we had in Seattle in the mid 80s was the Rocket magazine. It was a free monthly publication, and they had great writers, great designers, and they were covering a really fertile music scene, both locally and nationally. And I had learned in that magazine about a local band that was playing skate rinks, and on
like roller skating rink.
Yeah. And that was where the sort of burgeoning local metal scene was taking place, at skate rinks, because there was no sense in playing in bars. The audience wasn't there. The audience was
not old enough to be in.
Was not old enough. And so they had to find another spot. So there were keggers in the woods.
Sure.
But there were also the skating rinks. And on August 29th, 1982, I went to a show in a skate rink in Bellevue, of all places, called the Lake Hills Arena, commonly known as Crossroads. And it was called Metal Fest 2. And it was an all-day event, started at noon and went till way after midnight. The headliner was TKO, which is a very popular local band at the time. Had done a lot of regional touring, is a band of note in Seattle history. But I had gone to see a band called Culprit, who was from the East Side. And also on the bill that day were so many other bands that would really become my tribe over the next, decade practically. There was a band from Portland called the Wild Dogs. There was a band called Shadow, which featured a young Mike McCready from who went on to be in a band called Pearl Django. Is that right?
I think, Pearl something.
Pearl something.
Yeah. They did some cool stuff over the years.
Yeah, I think so.
They're still around too.
I believe so. Yeah. Culprit was amazing that day, and there was a band called Overlord, which was more of a sort of a street level rock band in a heavy metal setting. And that's the first time. And during Overlord's set, it dawned on me, and I really can remember it fairly clearly to this day. I looked around and it dawned on me that everybody in the crowd was just other kids. And a lot of them were in the next or the previous band. And this was not British rock stars on a 10-foot stage in a basketball arena. This was homegrown, real community, local music where everybody knew each other and everybody was supporting each other. And the guys on stage were just the dudes.
Yeah, they were just other guys.
And I remember Glenn Logan, he was the guitar player of Overlord, and he was just hawking these big loogies and smiling and laughing and pointing at his friends. And I was like, oh my God, this is possible.
Yeah.
This is totally possible. I'm experiencing this right now. And I became very much addicted to, and no drugs or alcohol. It was community in the purest sense and the loudest possible sense.
Right.
And physical, so physical, just headbanging, just clawing over the guy. I mean, just like a real pit.
Yeah.
In a couple of hundred kids in a skate rink.
Right.
And
yeah, because this is also not, we're not talking about thousands of people here. We're talking about literally a couple hundred people.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that became my tribe.
Right.
And those people, and I remembered those people from that day. I didn't know them yet. I was an outsider. I was a newbie, and I could see all those guys, and they obviously knew each other. And I was like, I want to be in that circle. I want to be talking to those guys. Mm-hmm. And within, a couple of months I was, and those bands, Culprit, Wild Dogs, Overlord, TKO to an extent, Shadow, those became the bands that I would go see all around South King County at these Skate Kings. And that was just a really important sort of development, piece of my personal and artistic development, really.
Yeah. And that scene at that time, I think, you and I have talked about this a little bit over the years, but that scene at that time, it was a precursor to what became the Seattle scene.
Sure.
In the, towards the end of the decade.
Yep.
And I think the thing that's most interesting to me, and the thing I'm really curious about, is your perspective on, because you were sort of in that at the time when this was all evolving,
mm-hmm.
is, what was that like? Because, I remember the first two Seattle bands I discovered, because I grew up in Denver, were first Soundgarden.
Yep.
And then Nirvana. And I discovered Nirvana through a friend of mine, a guy was in my band, the guitarist in my band had discovered Nirvana and brought the tape into the car on the way to band practice. Somebody's like, yeah, check this out. And so that was the Bleach album, right? And we were like, oh, wow, this is really different. This was like 89 when that came out. And this was like really different from the stuff we had been listening to at that point. But of course, we didn't know where it was heading, but we had seen Soundgarden at that point because they opened up for like Prong and Voivod. Like I remember seeing Soundgarden when they opened for bands like Voivod and Prong.
Wow, I didn't realize Prong was headlining that early, like it's got to be 1990 or...
That was 89 or 90.
Yeah.
Prong was the second band. Voivod was the headliner. And that's who we went to see. And we were like, oh, cool, Soundgarden. I think I've heard of them. And they were the opener.
Yeah.
And Chris Cornell was what, 18 at that point? And he was...
I don't think he was that young, but...
He was pretty young.
But they were... But yeah, that was fresh.
Right. So, bridge me that gap between TKO at the skate rink to like, how do we get to Soundgarden and Nirvana and Alice in Chains? And, and then I later want to talk about your band, because your band kind of came out of that same milieu as well.
Yeah. Yeah, it's difficult. And people ask that question, like, and I think a lot of people like to say that there was a lot of camaraderie and there was a lot of sort of courtesy between the scenes. Mm-hmm. Like the grunge bands were friendly to the metal bands, and that everything was kind of commingled. That wasn't my experience. I think that there was a club, and there's always clubs there, but it didn't ever feel to me like the metal guys, whether it was my metal band or me as a metal consumer, were in the club that became later to be known as grunge. And the earlier days of that scene, it seemed to happen very fast. I mean, I would be watching the F-Holes or Gorilla at the Squid Row, and then it seemed like I turned around and there was flannels on the cover of Time magazine or whatever it was. I was going to shows. I was seeing Love Battery, and I was seeing Tad, and I was seeing Soundgarden and Alice in Chains, and we were playing with Alice in Chains. And I guess Alice in Chains is a better example for me because they were kind of a metal band.
I think of them that way.
They were a glam. I mean, whatever the earlier incarnation of is a Tramp Alley. I guess I have to go back and do some homework, but it seems like Alice in Chains was Tramp Alley, and they were kind of a glam late 80s thing, and they kind of morphed into Alice in Chains. And they were from South King County, and we knew those guys, Well,
and I like to always remind people, of course, that Pantera was first a glam band, and a lot of people forget that.
That first record with Phil is, it's startling.
It's hair metal.
Yeah.
Full on.
Yeah. And
anyway.
Yeah, right. We digress, which is part of the point, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, Alice in Chains.
Yeah, those guys were cool, but we played with them a few times, and we would see them at parties, and they were always great. And Alice in Chains is probably the band that was closest to our orbit. They were a South King County band. We'd go to the same parties. We'd play on the same bills. We knew those guys. They were always wonderful. I mean, they probably weren't very wonderful, but they were cool.
Right.
And they were nice. And they seemed to me to be the band out of that, if you're going to talk about a big three or a big five, that seemed to be the most metal. Maybe just because I knew their origins better. I mean, Soundgarden's got a lot of metal components in it. But Alice in Chains, to me, seemed to be the band that was born of that more organically, at least from my observation point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I always liked their music. I didn't always like Soundgarden's music, but I think I liked almost everything Alice in Chains ever did. Facelift, chief among them. That's my favorite document, which is often the case. The first record,
Yeah, very good. I mean, I could do a whole probably monologue on Alice in Chains, but I'm I want to know kind of where this went for you.
Yeah, I mean, at that point, I was an observer of the explosion,
mm-hmm.
and I liked a lot of those bands, but I was still humping heavy metal,
right?
Which was kind of a dead end in the early 90s because labels were no longer calling.
Right.
They were no longer returning voicemails. They all wanted a grunge band.
Right.
And heavy metal was shut down fairly abruptly. I mean, it was as if things were like lights were being turned off.
In the US, certainly.
In the movement. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. It became very unfashionable to be heavy metal in the early 90s.
Yeah, I mean, there was definitely like really cool and important stuff happening like in Norway in the early 90s.
Oh.
But that's a completely different scene and had nothing to do really.
Ricky
directly.
Rackman wasn't
No, this was not
employed in the Netherlands.
That's right. So yeah, this the 90s was a tough decade for American metal in particular.
Yeah.
But tell me about your band, because Panic was around, when did that first album come out? 91.
First record came out in 91, but we were together in 85 since 85.
Right. So tell me about that path. Like, how did you guys meet? How did you guys decide to form a band? How did you, find your sound?
Yeah. I was a college student at Western, and there was another guy who was a rocker, and it was easy to spot other rockers in those days because it was the Reagan years and most guys were not rockers. So if you were both rockers, you ended up at the same party.
Yeah.
And his name was Rondo. He was a drummer, and he said, I'm in this metal band. We're looking for a singer. And I was like, I can totally sing, dude. And he said, great, let's go down and try out. So probably that weekend, we went down to South King County where the guitar player and the bass player lived. They were in high school still. And we tried out. I tried out. He said, here's the songs we're doing. You know, some Raven covers, some Iron Maiden covers. And it totally clicked. And that was it. And that was Cold Steel. That was May 18th, not to just get overly attached to dates again, but May 18th, 1985.
Yeah, you're better at that than I am.
You know, there's some dates that stand out in your mind, and that's one of them.
Sure.
I joined my first band, and that was pretty great. But the problem was that Rondo and I were in Bellingham going to school. Mm-hmm. Gary and George were in Auburn going to high school.
So 100 miles.
It's 100 miles, and it's and you could only rehearse on weekends.
Right.
George was working at Long Acres. That was a midday thing on the weekends. We had to kind of rehearse in the mornings, Saturday mornings, which was difficult. But that worked great, and we started writing songs almost immediately, working through covers and starting to add more original material. And Cold Steel was a good time into 1986.
So that was the first name of the band.
Cold Steel with one E. I think the Steel has an E on the end. It wasn't Cold A Steel A. It was Cold Steel A.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we had a great logo. Gary drew a great logo. We were all very invested, and those guys had gear and they had discipline, and we had a lot of, it was a fun time. Mm-hmm. Lots of enthusiasm.
And so when did that was it the same lineup that became Panic? Did you guys just change the name, or was there a different lineup?
No. Let's see. Rondo dropped out of college. And so George and Rondo, the bass player and the drummer, drove up to Bellingham and said, hey, we want to get rid of Gary. We want to get Marty in the band. Marty Chandler was a guitar player in a band called Strychnine. We had played with them a few times in the woods at Kager's.
Yeah.
And he was a pretty good guitar player. And I said, are you crazy? You want to get rid of Gary for Marty? And they were like, yeah, he's really good. I was outvoted 2-1. And we got Marty, who's now Metal Marty from the Super Suckers. And it was the right move. Marty's a shredding guitar player, a gifted musician, and was a great addition to the band. And then Marty and George drove to Bellingham 6 months later. So we want to get rid of Rondo. We want to get Jack. Jack was the drummer in Strychnine. And he was a double bass drummer, a complete animal.
Yeah.
And I said, are you crazy? You want to get rid of Rondo? He said, yes, 2-1. Boom, he's out. Jack's in. So those were the fairly unpleasant lineup changes. And that happens,
Right.
It's part of it. If you want to climb, you want to get better, you get better guys in the band.
Yeah.
Or you get more appropriate guys in the band.
And you're glad they never threw you out.
Never happened.
So I'm assuming you recorded a demo at some point, but I don't think I've ever heard it.
Yeah, you should play. This is where we should play it.
Okay, so a brief little interlude here. Thanks to the delightful nature of the internet, the Panic demo from 1987, which Jeff tells me had 100 cassette copies that were run back when they did the demo in 87. Someone had a copy of this. Jeff said he had one in his garage somewhere, but wasn't going to be able to find it for probably several months. And sure enough, somebody on the internet has digitized a couple songs from that demo. So I'm going to play you a little clip from one of those right now. That song is called Leave It Alone, and this is from Panic's 1987 demo.
Leave it
how did that come to be? And then how did you guys get connected with Metal Blade and with, with Gary Holt, the H team?
Yeah.
Like, how did that happen?
Yeah. So during that interim period when we first had the first drummer, when we still had the first drummer, we had some songs ready to go. We'd saved some money and we were going to go make a demo. And we got Terry Date. I mean, he had already done Louder Than Love. He'd done some other local stuff of significance. He hadn't yet done the national stuff that he would go on to do later. He wasn't yet Terry Date, but he was already kind of Terry Date.
Yeah.
And we went into Steve Lawson Studios in August of 87, I guess, and did 4 songs. And it's a beautiful tape. I mean, it's the first time we'd ever been in a recording studio. We had no idea what we were doing. Luckily, we had Terry Date to guide us. And our performances are great. The songs are great. The sound is pretty good. And it was a real strong first 4-song demo tape.
Yeah.
And we sent it out to all the labels and all the magazines. We got a little bit of note in the press, no labels called.
Right.
So then we changed drummers, and about a year later, we did a similar tape experience. We did 6 songs in Triad with Michael Tortorello, and that was when songs were starting to take on a more urgent feel because we had the double bass kit.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Right.
And one of the songs on that tape actually ended up on the first Panic record. So 911 was a song that we recorded on the demo. And another great thing about those demos was that it got a lot of local support with local underground radio. So Jeff Gilbert was a disc jockey at the time with KCMU college station. That was the University of Washington station, which is now KX, right? Or no,
KEXP.
KEXP.
Yeah.
And Jeff was very enthusiastic about those demos and played the shit out of the first and second Panic demos on Brain Pain, which was his Sunday night heavy metal show. Uh-huh. And Jeff was such an important connection for us in terms of just gaining legitimacy locally, because he was the guy. He was the guy north of San Francisco who was the most important metal endorsement you could possibly get was from Jeff Gilbert. And he played the Panic demos like crazy.
That's great.
Which allowed us to get better shows, which allowed us to build a band fund more aggressively, which allowed us to record more frequently. And we did a couple other demos, sending them out to the labels all the time without representation. And of course, nothing happened because it was just not a time when you could do that. You couldn't just anonymously, unsolicitedly send a demo to a major label and get a record deal.
Right. It just wasn't an expectation.
No.
So
in the summer of 91, Seattle had a sort of a South by Southwest music association called the Northwest Area Music Association. And they had a convention. And we had been invited to do a showcase in the afternoon, which flopped. I remember Sandy Pearlman, the brilliant Blue Oyster Cult lyricist, telling us we'd played much too loud to be in a convention center in the afternoon, and he was right. Luckily, we had a Sunday night showcase also scheduled for the Central Tavern in Pioneer Square. And at that showcase was Gary Holt from Exodus and his manager, Tony Isabella. And we played a great show that night, and Gary probably had come to Seattle with the express purpose of finding a young Seattle metal band to produce. We happened to be in the right place at the right time. And he asked us after the show, I want to make your record. I want to put you under my wing and make your record.
Oh, cool.
And that was a big discovery. That was a big time. I mean, Sanctuary had been similarly discovered by Mustaine, right? And that had been a fruitful endeavor for both entities, and we were starstruck, and this is going to be great. And it was great.
Yeah.
Tony shopped us. Tony Isabella, Gary's manager, shopped us around, and unfortunately, by 1991, all of the major labels were just looking for a G band.
Yeah.
And we were in front of tons of majors and just could not get anybody interested enough to bite.
Yeah.
Shopped to the minors, and we finally signed a deal with Metal Blade in 91.
Yeah. And so that was what, you guys made 2 records with Metal Blade, right?
Made 2 records with Metal Blade, yeah.
Yeah. So what was going on? I mean, did you guys tour these records? Like, how did it go from there? Like,
yeah.
And what was it like working with Gary? Because I've actually never met him, and I would love to I'm hoping to interview him at some point.
Oh, that'd be great. He's a great interview.
Maybe you could help me get to him. But yeah, I'm just interested in like, what was that like? Because you guys are coming in the same year that Nevermind changed everything. But of course, nobody knew in 91 what direction this was. It's easy for us to Monday morning quarterback it now. But in 91, nobody knew what direction this was going to go. Nobody knew what it was going to look like by 92 or 3. So you're right. Like the major labels were totally looking for, all they wanted was grunge, I'm sure.
Yeah, that was the cutting edge. And coming out of the late 80s where the Frankenstein monster that MTV had created
with Headbangers Ball,
with heavy metal was just, it was everywhere.
Yeah.
And that was an exciting time to come out. Although, obviously that thing had been humped fairly dry.
Yeah, sure.
But there was still an audience.
Yeah.
And we were doing super valid music. And it was incredible to hook up with Gary. Although Exodus was not our favorite band in that genre, not by a long shot. But Gary was great, and Rick was great, and Tony was great, and we had access to some pretty high level management. Tony worked for Bill Graham.
Yeah.
And that was really exciting to be like in that office. We were part of that Bay Area, real serious like aristocracy history.
Yeah.
And
like metal aristocracy.
It was just rock and roll aristocracy. Like Bill Graham presents. What's more important to, the advancement of rock music than Bill Graham and the Fillmore West, Mm-hmm. So this is 1991. So it's not exactly, we're not exactly, in Golden Gate Park, but, it was great. And Tony got us that good deal, and we got a recording budget, and we got a video budget, and we made a video with a filmmaker here from Bellingham that was in circulation on Headbangers Ball.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually had a friend who was writing for Rolling Stone at the time, and he got us a New Faces column. So we got a color photograph in Rolling Stone.
Yeah.
And a nice piece in Rip, and just got a real bump. And Exodus, or the H Team plus Zetro from Exodus, did some tracks on the record,
mm-hmm.
and we recorded it in San Francisco in January of 1991. Great experience. Did it at Sandy Pearlman's room, Alpha and Omega, in the Tenderloin district of San Francisco.
Mm-hmm.
Stayed at the Phoenix. Phoenix Hotel is at the corner of Larkin and Eddy, and it's a famous hotel for traveling bands.
Yeah.
Lots of debauchery over the years there, and terrific experience.
Yeah.
The record came out in June, and we did get on the road in the early autumn. Did 10 weeks out in the Midwest and on the East Coast. Toured with Nuclear Assault and Coroner from Switzerland.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a real heavy metal tour.
Yeah, for sure.
Mm-hmm. And we were opening. We were the young band, and those guys were pacing themselves, and we were not.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember I was really into Nuclear Assault for a hot minute.
Sure.
Back in the late 80s. But yeah, that would have been a cool tour. I wish I would have seen that.
Yeah.
But yeah, so you toured, and then the next album came out a year and a half later or so.
Something like that. Yeah, maybe mid 93. It's about a year.
Yeah.
Good batch of songs, but not the greatest vocal performance. I'll say for myself, I think the singing was pretty shitty on that second Panic record, and I just didn't. It was drying up.
Yeah.
Management was drying up. Tours were drying up. There just wasn't the demand.
Yeah. The appetite for metal really changed.
Product wasn't as good, but I think if it had been several years earlier, the product would have been of less substance, but the product was not that great.
Yeah. Did you guys split up after that second album? Did you tour that second album? What?
We did some regional touring, and I think I remember in San Francisco in summer of 93, I think this is probably done.
Yeah.
I left San Francisco and went on another trip, came back to Seattle, and then I think Marty and I had kind of decided that was going to be it. We did play out the summer. We had a bunch of gigs scheduled, and we did play out the summer to pay back some debts.
Yeah.
By this time we were no longer managed by Tony. We had a new manager who had taken on some debt on our behalf, and we felt obligated to try to pay her back as much as we could. So we played some gigs.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then, then where did it go from there? I know that you were in another band a few years later called Watts.
Yeah, several years later, I guess the Watts thing came up in about 99. Some of my idols, my garage rock idols from Bellingham by that time, Dave Kreider from Estrus Records,
yep.
and Aaron Roeder, also from the Monomen, who owned the 3B Tavern.
Yep.
They had just broken up the Monomen.
And the 3B, now known as the Shakedown.
It's not the same room.
Oh, it's not the same room.
Not the exact same room. Same street.
Yeah.
No, but the 3B is the thrift store.
Oh, okay. Yeah. But it's the same block.
Same block.
Yeah, okay.
Same and the same vibe.
Yeah, for
but
sure.
There's no replacing. There was never any replacing the 3B. It was a very special place and time that, the late 90s and the early part of the 2000s at the 3B Tavern.
Yeah.
It was unlike anything. I mean, I think it was a smaller scene, and I had maybe more of an ownership stake in it, but I mean, not that I had any ownership, but I had, quote unquote ownership.
Yeah, yeah.
And that was an amazing
spiritual ownership. If
totally.
You will. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so where did that, what was that band all about? Now you guys made an album.
Made an album on Estrus, and Dave's songs, and we played quite a bit. We played quite a bit regionally during 99 and 2000. I had to leave when we were expecting our second child, because the band was based in Bellingham. Patty and I were living in Seattle, and that was that's
a commute.
Yeah, not sustainable to be driving to Bellingham once a week for band practice and then touring all over the place when there was 2 little kids at home.
Right.
So I had to leave that band, and they actually replaced me and replaced Aaron, the drummer, and they did some regional touring. They toured nationally on that first Watts record. That's a special place in my heart for that time and for that material. I was
not a metal band though.
No, definitely. I mean, the Monomen had come from their garage rock beginnings, and they wanted to do something heavier. And I had come from my heavier metal beginnings, and I wanted to go garage rock. So we kind of met in the middle, going opposite directions. Yeah. And the result is a very hard rock, not metal at all.
Right.
But a hard rock, sort of more noise, almost. There's a lot of MC5 and a lot of. There's some noise in that record.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's a fun record, and I'll play some clips of that too, probably. Yeah. Given everything we've just talked about and the intervening years, because you basically haven't been in a hard, heavy band since 2000 or so. So it's been 20 some odd years. Mm. What are your thoughts on where metal is at today? I mean, you still think of yourself as a metalhead. I know that about you. But what are your thoughts on where metal's at today? Where is it going? Talk to me about that.
Well, I guess I'm not positive that I still think of myself as a metalhead. I think of myself as a nostalgic metalhead, and I have that history. But
fair enough.
I'm a little unlike yourself. I don't work to keep myself current.
Yeah.
And a lot of what I know or learn about new metal is through you, and through other younger, more involved people that I know. And so I'm encouraged that it's viable. And I think it's more possible for different genres of music that may not be entirely in fashion at the time to stay viable, because there's so many vehicles for connection, and the internet is so useful for that. And so I think it's easier. It's harder to fall completely out of fashion these days, because there's always nostalgia. But I am not super current.
No, that's fair. I think it's okay to be, nostalgic. So let's talk nostalgia. When you're feeling nostalgic these days, what do you go back to? Do you go all the way back to Kiss? What are your favorite things to go back to? How often do you go back to Love Gun?
Yeah. Well, I had
Where it all began.
Where it all began. Well, I've had the fairly unique experience of having in my household a young Kiss fan.
Mm-hmm.
So my son, when he was growing up, had that same exact arc of mine, except it started when he was 3 instead of when he was 12. So by the time he was 5, he was already in his AC/DC phase, and he was in Van Halen at 6, and he was completely in Alice Cooper when he was 8.
Yeah.
So to be able to revisit that through his eyes and go through all those phases and go through a Ramones phase and go through a Deep Purple phase and go through, though that kept me sort of at least nostalgically current during those years. So going back to Kiss was easy in the first part of this century because it was in my household, played much louder than I was ever allowed to play it in my household when I was 12. So I've had that revisitation of the Kiss thing.
Yeah.
On purpose, I don't go back and listen to Love Gun very frequently, but it comes to me, so coincidentally.
Yeah.
Frequently.
Yeah, yeah. Any parting thoughts on sort of this conversation about like, a life in music and a life in metal, and what has it all meant to you? Like,
yeah, well, rock and roll and heavy metal to an extent have been my identity my entire adult life. I managed to get through college, and I managed to raise some kids, and I managed to have a career that didn't involve those entities, but it's always been my underlying identity.
Mm-hmm.
And I wouldn't have it any other way. What I do find tiresome often is, I guess it is the nostalgia. It is the constant reunions and the constant digging up of old logos and trotting out watered down or sort of reanimated versions of those same entities. The casino circuit.
Yeah.
And you got to make a living, and metal's pretty popular in the casinos these days.
For sure.
And not just metal, but 70s hard rock. And I wouldn't begrudge any of those guys a paycheck, but trivializing it and the irony of going to see some of these older bands, going to see you put together a bill, and it's Foreigner and Loverboy and whoever else is, available. And that to me is distasteful.
Yeah.
But if there's a market for it, you can continue to do it. That being said, I am totally stoked to have tickets to Wasp and Armored Saint this summer at the Moore Theater, where it all began for me.
Yeah.
2 of my very favorite metal bands, and I think both of those bands are metal bands.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. For sure.
But the first Wasp record for me is such an important record, and Armored Saint, John Bush has just always been one of my very favorite metal singers, and that's going to be cool to see those guys in that small room.
Yeah.
And I'm looking forward to that, but I don't, unlike yourself, I don't get out to see metal very often. When I do, it's a moving, visceral experience.
Yeah, and I think, you probably I'm fairly indiscriminate at this point in my life where, for me, I like what I like, but if I see a show that I'm even remotely interested in and it happens to be on a night where I'm free, I just go. Like, I don't think twice about it. And I'm at a point in my life where I can do that. And, so there was a time where it was like, okay, if I wanted to go see a show, it had to be on a Friday or Saturday night. Yeah. And it had to be relatively close, and it had to be somebody I was dying to see. I just don't care anymore. I'm going to that show. Sure. I went to a show this past weekend, 5 bands. It was down in Seattle, and it was 5 bands I didn't know at all. But a friend of mine was like, "Hey, are you at all interested in coming to the show?" I was like, "Yeah, sure, I'll go to the show. Whatever. How bad can it be?" I've never once regretted going to a metal show.
Good on you, man.
Was it the best show I've ever seen? I'm not going to talk trash about the band that I saw this past weekend. Was it the best show I've ever seen? No. Was it the worst? No, it was fine. And it was fun. And I had a good time. And I check some more bands off my list. Hey, I've seen them. Yeah, cool.
Totally.
So, it was one of those shows where like the headliner, in my opinion, was actually not the best band on the bill. Like
Right.
it was the one right before the headliner I thought was the best band. They were great actually. And all 4 other bands were sort of like, but whatever. It was fun.
I'm so glad that it's being done. I'm so glad that there is a new and a contemporary metal scene. I mean, I remember when the kids started first wearing Iron Maiden shirts and peg jeans 15 years ago, and I thought I was so surprised. But I think it's great that it's a viable genre and that it's growing. It's obviously growing, and that there's so much energy and enthusiasm behind it.
Oh, for sure. I mean, it's a great time for metal. There's just a renaissance happening, right before our eyes. I mean, it's every possible subgenre that you can think of. There's truly something for everyone. Like when you and I were kids and first getting into metal, like metal was kind of one thing. There was metal and then there was not metal.
Yeah.
And now it's like, you've got 6 different genres of subgenres of black metal and several different genres of death metal and all these different things. Like that just didn't exist when we were kids, because it was like, okay, well, are you going to the metal show? And we didn't really even split hairs too much on things like, well, is Def Leppard a metal band or not? Like we didn't really. It was just like, okay, cool. Yeah, they were harder and heavier than anybody else, so they were metal. They were metal enough for me. And so yeah, I mean, it's been interesting to see this all evolve and for it to go through the 90s and emerge out of the 90s. And for us to be where we are today, where it's truly like it's an embarrassment of riches, really, in terms of how much metal there is to consume and how many different things you can experience,
Yeah.
If you could have dinner or drinks with any metal artist, living or dead, who would it be? It's a tough question, I know.
That's a very difficult question, Brian, but I guess after thinking about it for the 7 minutes that you cut out, it's got to be Ronnie.
Ronnie James Dio.
Got to be Ronnie James Dio.
Yeah?
I mean, I think obviously a thoughtful, grounded genius.
I also heard he was a very good cook, so you'd probably have really good food if he cooked.
Oh, that's true.
Yeah. But anyway.
I mean, I don't know if you saw that Dio documentary, but there were so many things in the movie that were revealed that made Ronnie more human than he might otherwise or previously have seemed.
Mm-hmm.
He always seemed so completely inhuman.
Yeah.
And he almost levitated. And not that he didn't levitate, but I think that a lot of the emphasis of the documentary was to assign Ronnie some human characteristics that might not otherwise have been or previously have been associated with him. And he was funny and liked to have a drink and just a more of a human being than the heavy metal god. Godliness is not what you want to have dinner with.
Right.
But the Ronnie James Dio that I got to know better in watching his documentary, I'd love to have dinner with him.
Yeah, for sure.
Especially if he cooked.
Yeah. Do you think, I mean, there's lots of discussion about this, but do you think that, is he the greatest heavy metal vocalist of all time?
Yeah, I think I do think he is. There was a period in my life when the first Dio records were coming out, whatever, 83, 4, when...
You mean the first Dio solo record?
The solo records,
yeah. Right.
When I listened to almost nothing other than Dio, I was either listening to those first 2 Dio records, or I was listening to the Sabbath stuff,
mm-hmm.
or I was listening to the Rainbow stuff.
Yeah.
And I would just toggle in between. It was like toggling in between Kiss Love Gun and Kiss Alive 2 and Ace Frehley's solo record and Dress to Kill or whatever. I would just like, and I had access to, I had such a broad base of music by then, but I was just in this Dio thing.
Yeah.
And he's such a captivating performer, and he was such a perfectionist. And the thing that I found was so hilarious about the documentary was in the 90s, when we have already decided, you and I, were not the best time for heavy metal. And Ronnie just continued to put out records. He didn't give a fuck. He was just putting out Dio records because he was Ronnie James Dio.
Yeah.
And there was an interview with an engineer from some of those sessions, and Ronnie would go in and he would do basics with the band, and then they're tracking, right? And Ronnie stays in the booth, and he's tracking with them, even though they're scratch vocals. Nothing's being kept.
Yeah.
He's just tracking for the band. And the engineer says, Ronnie, we can keep your scratch vocal. You don't have to keep singing.
Yeah.
And he's like,
no, I want to.
He's like, fuck that, I'm Ronnie James Dio.
Yeah, yeah.
Just like, I'm going to keep doing it.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's awesome.
There's some, obviously there are singers with greater ranges, and, obviously Halford has the range, and John Bush is such a muscular, killer metal singer.
Yeah.
It's Ronnie James Dio for me, I think, yeah.
And that's our show for the week. During our conversation, around the time earlier when I was talking about the early 1990s, I said something along the lines of metal was effectively dead in the U.S. or something like that. Of course, that wasn't true entirely. I just wanted to clarify what I meant there. There was a ton of interesting stuff that happened, especially in death metal during the early 90s and even throughout the rest of the decade. The early part of the decade especially is arguably when the strongest foundations of death metal as we know it today were built here in the U.S. with bands like Deicide and Death and Obituary and some others, doing really groundbreaking stuff throughout that period. But in the context of my conversation with Jeff, what I was really referring to was that huge surge, particularly of thrash metal, of which Panic was a part of that surge. A small part, but a part of that surge. And that surge was coming fast and furious and hard from around 1983 all the way through the end of the 1980s, pretty quickly losing its momentum around the time that Metallica's Black Album came out in 1991, which was really when thrash metal as we knew it kind of hit the mainstream, and it changed a lot. And most people would agree that that album was kind of a watershed moment for thrash. Which had been, dominating so much of the conversation up to that point in the U.S. And after that, mainstreaming of thrash, it was going to be several years before any of the underground stuff that was going on, stuff like bands like Panic that were doing underground stuff, were, going to have any kind of a renaissance. So I feel like it's safe to say that while the 90s was not a dead decade for metal in America, the 90s was sort of a strange decade. Let's just say it that and kind of leave it at that. Especially in contrast with all the incredible things that we saw in the 1980s. There was a lot of metal that was coming out in the 1980s, as Jeff mentioned. Ronnie James Dio was putting out records. There were other bands that were putting out records all through the 90s, but the vast majority of stuff that is still celebrated today, I think it's safe to say that outside of death metal, very little of what's celebrated today is from the 1990s. Most of what people still fondly look back on is from the 80s or from more recently than the 90s. So anyway, I realize this is a hot take, but, we live in a hot take economy, so please feel free to argue with me about this. Of course, I welcome your cards and letters. Anyway, I think now I'm going to go listen to Kiss Love Gun, and then I'm going to follow it up with High and Dry by Def Leppard, and then I'll probably go listen to some Dio albums. So I suggest you do something similar. This podcast is a production of Studio Portcullis. Our theme music is by Tauntaun. If you have comments, questions, suggestions for guests you'd like to see on the show, please email them to me at metalgatewaypodcast@gmail.com or slide into my DMs on Instagram @metalgateway. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you next week.